From the Journeys of Belonging to Blackness Digital Media Project, I'm Yndia Lorick-Wilmot, and you're listening to the podcast, Talking Journeys of Belonging to Blackness. Good day. It's Thursday, June 11th, and I am your host, Yndia Lorick-Wilmot. I am inspired by a quote by Harry Belafonte, where he says, "We use our craft, our artistry to uplift people. Despite our location, it has not deterred our Black consciousness. We have not left the community. I am physically removed from the community, but I am spiritually connected. As long as there is one Black brother or a Black sister in the world in bondage, there is no freedom for me. We are all in the same darkness." In the last 12 to 14 days, we have seen a huge global response to the racial injustice and state-sanctioned violence inflicted upon African descendants in the US, as we've witnessed the recent murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, as well as countless brothers and sisters who have lost their lives at the hands of police and white vigilantes. Rallies, memorials, mural tributes have been held in countries across Africa, Gambia, Ghana, and Zimbabwe, places in Europe such as England, Italy, Ireland, Poland, the Caribbean, and Central America, as well as cities in Mexico, Canada, Brazil, Australia, and New Zealand, all with people shouting, "Black Lives Matter," "No justice, no peace," "Silence is violence," and "Color is not a crime," in their major town squares, in front of the US Embassy, and in their streets. Last week, I facilitated part one of a reflective conversation with three US-based African-descended scholars and practitioners whose work around issues of race, community, and equity sit at the praxis of service and social justice. And I engaged in this conversation to get their thoughts on these protests and the possibility for the eradication of racial injustice. Today, we are continuing the dialogue by focusing on the works and efforts of creatives, scholars, and practitioners representing the African diaspora from across the globe. Joining us are Masauko Chipembere. Masauko is a musician and activist. He was born in Los Angeles while his family was in exile from Malawi, where they continued to battle for human rights and dignity for all. Welcome.
Thank you, Yndia.
Next, we have Desiree Gordon. Desiree is a cultural strategist and a cultural producer with a special interest in the role the arts and cultural heritages play in catalyzing sustainable and radical, imaginative, holistic, and thriving communities. She's curated and produced art-based community engagement initiatives at the Brooklyn Museum, the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute, the Schomburg Center, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Brooklyn Arts Council. Welcome, Desiree. Desiree, turn on your mic.
Yeah, thank you, Yndia. Sure.
Yes, perfect. Next, and by no relation, we also have Dr. Natasha Gordon-Chipembere. She holds a PhD in English. Natasha is a writer, professor, and founder of the Tengo Said Writers Retreats in Costa Rica. She writes on slavery and Afro-Latinos in the diaspora. In June 2014, she moved to Heredia. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Heredia, Costa Rica, her maternal homeland, with her husband and two children from Brooklyn, New York. Welcome.
Hello, welcome.
And last but definitely not least, we have Javier Wallace. Javier is currently a PhD candidate, and for those who are in this space know, he's also ABD and can really anticipate and be excited about being ABD as a PhD candidate. He's pursuing his PhD in physical education, teacher education at the University of Texas at Austin, where he researches issues surrounding race, class, gender, labor migration, nationality, and transnationalism of athletes from the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean. He is of US and Panamanian heritage and has served as athletic director and physical educator in the Republic of Panama. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
That's right. It is a splendid morning, and I'm really excited about this conversation that we're about to have. But before we dive in, I would like to ask for a moment of silence for George Floyd and all those who have lost their lives under police brutality. Thank you. Let's get into it. Okay, so perhaps you all have heard this, but growing up, I heard the familiar saying, if the US sneezes, the Caribbean catches a cold, which I think, and yes, I see all the nuts, and which I think speaks to the neo-colonial and the cultural imperialist relationship the United States has with the Caribbean as well as many countries around the world. Wherever there existed colonialism, white supremacy and systemic racism have long been used to justify and support nation-state sanctioned discrimination and violence against African descendants, right? And we've definitely seen that in the midst of the global pandemic of COVID, as well as the most recent murders here in the last 2 months, where everyone's supposed to be self-quarantined, right? So I think we can all agree that people have reached their breaking point. Enough is enough. The outcry and the protests that we see in the streets of cities across the US, but also worldwide, have definitely revealed not only injustice and inequity, but also a deep level of grief, would you say, and anger that has become too much to bear when it comes to the perpetual loss of life and the persistent unequal treatment of African descendants worldwide. So in true academic fashion, of course, I have to ask this large overarching question of all of you. And what I want you all to briefly speak to is some of the professional ways you and your work have been impacted both by COVID and the recent rebellions and uprisings we've seen, not only in the US, but also abroad in your homeland and in your countries. Natasha.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so as an academic and as a teacher, I think obviously COVID affected me fairly immediately in March. Since I'm based in Costa Rica, classes moved online March 16th. And the Ministry of Education has basically prolonged. They do not have a reopening date in sight. And so that means that all online teaching has been fully institutionalized. So in the public and private sectors of the education system, everything is online. And that obviously impacted my work greatly, right? Instead of going into a venue, teaching in front of students. But what I find is that pretty much once the students got used to the idea of being online indefinitely, right? So at first it was this idea of, okay, we're gonna go back next week, right? And then the numbers started to increase and more conversations around, closing borders and all these things started to increase. Once the students were able to sort of transition that immediate sense of loss, I felt that the thing that they could control was their learning. And so what I found is that the students showed up way more and were definitely engaged in the time we had face-to-face instruction. And that's one of the things I did. All my instruction was face-to-face and live. So I was able to pause and even though there was a lot of Zoom fatigue, right? So it's that thing of being in front of the screen all day instead of moving around and engaging. But I felt that there was, so that affected my work in regards to my professional career in teaching. So the students just had to be online. And I feel like the biggest part of my work immediately was the emotional support, right? Which was a lot, right? But I think that that was necessary to really check in on the mental health of the students. So that became part of my work that I was really clued into and really tried to incorporate as I engaged with my students.
Javier?
Yes. Well, for me, immediately speaking, I'm engaged in international education with the University of Texas through our Division of Diversity and Community Engagement. But then I also do international educational experiences and tours with one of my companies, Afro Latino Travel, and we were organizing a spring break excursion into Panama with some students that immediately was canceled because of COVID-19, and of course that financially had immediate impacts. We also had to postpone our program that goes to Costa Rica during our Maymester, which was very disappointing on many reasons, but we understand why. So that's with the university. Of course, with my candidacy into having a PhD, my research is located somewhat in Panama. So I wasn't able to go this summer to a little bit of that field research for an ethnography that I'm writing, part of my dissertation. But some interesting things have emerged from not being able to go to Panama because of the restrictions. I've really been able to dive deeper into different sources to really contextualize things better in the experiences that I write about, and more particularly now, given the continuation of Black people being rendered as bodies to be exterminated at the hands of officials, this is really an interesting time because my work deals with Black boys, particularly. I cannot exclude Black women, but Black boys as a focus in Panama that continuously, in the same way that we see in the United States, have been impacted by institutionalized violence, which comes sometimes, and most times in their instances, in a physical way with police and their interaction with law enforcement. So this is an opportune time, to be quite honest, for me to engage in these conversations, what I'm doing with my work, because I'm able to make these large connections in ways where people can really are pulling from things that are happening in different spaces and making them relatable to what they're experiencing in their individual context. So that's where I'm going now professionally, with everything that's happening now.
Thank you. Desiree?
You know, I really love this question, thinking professionally and really thinking about labor. In my work here in New York, the first experience of this public health crisis was, and I mean immediately, the financial crisis. It was the collision of the financial crisis on the cultural community here in New York and so many other places. And it really, the public health crisis of COVID became almost more critically a distiller, a revealer of sort of economic inequities and economic instability, systems of resource distribution in the cultural community that serve to keep the cultural community in peril. We've normalized a kind of vulnerability in the cultural community. And I mean, when I say cultural community, I mean both artists, cultural producers, arts administrators, all throughout the field. There's a level of peril that has been normal, and that COVID really has served to open, to make that more acute and more revelatory to lots of other people. We created a few emergency response programs that were bringing together elected officials, bringing together thought leaders to really respond to the immediate crisis, but also to imagine, what do alternative models look like? What might an alternative economy, what is restorative as opposed to extractive capitalism? and how that works in the cultural community. How might we organize ourselves differently? What do cooperative studios look like? What kind, rather than sort of asking landlords to not kick artists out of studios, how can we organize around artists owning commercial buildings? What's the organization that needs to happen around rezoning so that we can have those decisions being made in a way that reflect the actual needs and aspirations of folk. And most of these aspirations are frankly modest. They're human rights, right? And again, in Antigua, COVID primarily experienced as an economic crisis in a place where people depend on tourism and had to close their borders for months at a time. There's no question that COVID has not made very many people sick in Antigua, but it's made very many people hungry in Antigua, yeah? And even now, as we open our borders on the 1st, and commercial flights started to come into the country on the 4th, the question, the negotiation, the gamble is health or work, right? And creatively, I think you might have mentioned creatively, because that creative work is a part of my sort of professional scope. I'm a vocalist, singer-songwriter person. Interestingly, this moment has really pulled me, lots of opportunities. People want, come and sing, come and do the work that's really ministry work, the work that's really spiritual development work. That kind of creative work has been very much called for at this time.
Thank you. Masauko.
Yes, I want to start by saying that what's happening in my world as a musician is really an extension of what's happening in Des's world, because this year I was supposed to be touring New York, Malawi, South Africa. I had won a grant from an organization in the United States to do that, and the Mid-Atlantic Arts Grant. And you know, all these tours are now off, and my band is an international band where I show up, you know, coming from the Western world, and the other musicians are from Malawi, and we were meeting in South Africa in order to do concerts there. Now, for me, it's tough that this tour was canceled. Luckily, the modern kind of context within the States, which Des can speak to more later, I imagine, is this notion that, you know, they allowed those who won grants, many people allowed us to keep a certain amount of the money that came from the grant instead of taking it back, which showed an ethic of care, which is very unique and something I think is really beautiful that's happening in this time. But that doesn't solve the issue necessarily for my Malawian friends who needed to show up in South Africa and be able to make the money in that South African economy. Because Malawi, of course, anytime the world stumbles, if the Caribbean is getting a cold, Malawi is getting pneumonia, you know, because we sit as one of the four or five poorest countries on the planet at any given time. And our infrastructure is poor at best. So for artists, a lot of times their ability to survive depends on being able to get out of Malawi and go to a Ghana, go to a South Africa, go to a place, Nigeria, a place with a stronger economy. So for me personally, of course, again, like as Des said, there's been more desire for me to participate in events to raise money for medical supplies in Malawi, or just conversations on how to move forward as artists, people wanting me to sing left and right. Of course, none of this helps the economy. You know, like there's no provision really for how to maintain as an artist right now. So as usual, we're back into the spiritual space and really trying to create and write and feel this moment. Because if I've got to go through it where times are tough, as an artist, in a way, that's when we're supposed to get busy, right? It's because we're inside the common feeling of the people. So I've been writing a lot. I've created a thing called the COVID Files, which is just songs I'm sort of putting together to deal with this time and moment. And I'll be putting them out weekly through my Instagram and my Facebook.
I really appreciate all of you and your responses in terms of being reflective around the ways in which COVID and then just this historical moment broadly has impacted your work. I mean, I can't help but to think about Miriam Makeba when she says, I don't sing politics, I sing only the truth. And I think very broadly speaking, when you are creative, oftentimes your platform or your product is quite reflective of the things that as artists and creatives you get to see and you feel, and it's the truth. And that's why in many ways, whether it's through song, whether it's through different forms of art medium, that's why it just cognitively and emotionally resonates with so many people. And so I appreciate both you, Masauko, and Desiree for helping to make that connection for some folks to be able to appreciate, well, what does this mean for when you are creative and that is your primary space in which you operate from, right? Not that, oh, it's a hobby, but this is like, no, this is what I'm passionate, this is what I'm called to, this is my work. And I think for all of you, what really resonates for me is this same sort of theme that I was able to uncover in my part one of my conversation, that there's something about this historical moment and with COVID that has helped to do really an unveiling of the different kinds of tensions that exist societally, right? So for you, Natasha, you're talking about the fact that, oftentimes young people feel that they don't have control, right? But they're looking to their schoolwork, as finite of a world that it is, that's the only place that they can feel maybe perhaps there's some control. The rest of you talked about this unveiling around just, what it means that the stressors of a pandemic has unveiled the exacerbation of poverty and inequality that so many people see, and then that's compounded with the most recent violence. So I appreciate this purview from a professional standpoint, but I also think about it from a personal standpoint. And I think about George Floyd, for example, with his final breaths of life, he cried out for his mother, the person who gave him life, right? Who was present when he took his first breath. He's calling out to her in his last. And as sadly, poetic as that moment was to watch, I can just only imagine what it was like, not just for people like myself, but also for you and others. Can you all speak to the personal impacts of this historical moment and even understanding what this means, even as a parent of children, or if you're in spaces where you're mentoring young people? What has this done for all of you?
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Okay. Well, Masauko and I have two children, a 19-year-old son who's just finished his first year at university, who has returned to us as the borders closed because he studied outside of Costa Rica. And we have a 15-year-old who is a 9th grader. And so maybe Masauko can speak to our son, and I will speak about some of the interactions in processing this time with our daughter, who's 15. So I would say one of the things I've observed in our conversations, because we haven't left our house. This is week, I think, 13 or 14, Costa Rica, full lockdown, curfews. They have been very vigilant. I think that what has happened is, unfortunately, there's a new surge that has happened because there was a lessening of curfews as we thought we flattened the curve. And in actuality, the numbers are becoming frighteningly sort of exponential in regards to a population of less than 5 million. So I think, but in the process of being home, we have to engage with each other, right? And I think my daughter, who obviously is a digital native, has been very much consuming, right? As the uprising started, she is really trying to process, and emotionally, lots of tears, lots of, sitting down at the table and hours of talking. And one of the things that I remember she said was sort of like, well, why aren't you in tears? Why aren't you as emotional as I am? Why aren't you as loud? I've signed 95,000 petitions. I have shared all this in social media. All these people who are showing up now, I see their duplicity. I mean, she's really critiquing it. And what I said to her was that, no, honey, there are always tears. I mean, internal mourning obviously happens because that is in many ways, that's the experience of Blackness in the world, right? I was just like, but I was born into a world that already just killed Malcolm, had murdered Emmett Till, and had just killed Martin. And so that was the inheritance that in growing up in Brooklyn that we had absorbed. And so it's not about the tears right now and the frustration, but it is about reading history. And that's kind of the conversations that we've been having. And I think she was looking for a place for activism, to be inside of her Black girl body and to add her voice to something. And she was so excited because there is an organization that I'm part of called Costa Rica Afro. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in terms of what's manifesting in Costa Rica, but there was a virtual march and she found it on Instagram and she was just like, Mom, there's this thing. And she made her sign and we got on, and it was incredible because for the first time in Costa Rica, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people on the Zoom call, lots of Afro-Costa Ricans and Mestizo or white presenting Costa Ricans, but in solidarity. And they were having these conversations. And she felt like an insider because this conversation was happening in Spanish. And because she is now fluent in the language, she was able to sit inside of that particular political moment that I think allowed her to feel a sense of belonging here and actually being able to do something as well as participate in sort of the virtual solidarity that she's been experiencing. So we're having conversations all the time, but I'm really interested in how she's processing. And then there's just some time where I'm just like, you got to get off social media. You got to go outside, walk the dog, get in the car with dad and drive. But there's also a time when the anxiety level is going to be too high because you can't process all of it. So and I think that will go back to some ideas I have around self-care and, rest is resistance.
Thank you. Javier?
Well, maybe, sorry.
Oh, Masauko,
No.
You can jump in.
Well, since you was talking about our daughter, I thought I'd go straight to our son, and then probably Javier can lean in on this because a lot of my son and I, our conversations are around sports. So one of the ones we had 2 weeks ago, or about 10 days ago, we were really excited because we started hearing the NBA was coming back. And so we started our usual back and forth about Kawhi Leonard versus LeBron James and blah, 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 blah. But yesterday, a couple of days ago, I posed an idea to him and we both kind of thought about it, which was the idea that, okay, let's look at this global moment we're in right now. We are dealing as Black men with a struggle for our basic humanity, right? What if the Black men in the NBA just chose not to play this year? What if they chose this as the year where they said, absolutely no more. We're going to join the people and not go back into playing because playing will become a distraction from the larger movement that we're involved in. It'll give capitalism that appeal again, which will slow down what we're trying to do in changing the system. And my son looked at me and said, Dad, if they did that, these guys would probably go down on the Mount Rushmore of sports because that'd be sort of the most important move ever made in sports history. And we both agreed on that. And then we said, you know, and then of course we went, nah, they won't do it. But those
right, because of the fear of the almighty dollar. I mean, that's scary, right?
Absolutely. And there's no precedent by which people would understand the move. We also talked about the idea that if they did it, they'd make basketball the international sport of the world, because all of a sudden people would understand basketball significance in a totally different way. It'd be a Muhammad Ali moment, right, for the planet in terms of basketball and how people considered it. But we're having those kind of talks, trying to deal with the complexity of participation or non-participation and what this moment really is, because since we're in Costa Rica, we're able to think about what this moment is globally. And one of the things I find in so many of the conversations I'm seeing in the States is it's very hard for people to perceive the idea that you're now the vanguard of a global movement. It's not just about police brutality. It's now about the way class systems work all over the world, because the same sort of policing is happening to people everywhere. And I'm glad that where we are, we're able to see that. My son's been in conflicts with friends who are from Brazil, because he has white Brazilian friends who tend to see, who are in a panic because they're afraid the brothers are coming over the wall, you know? And he can't relate, because what he's seeing with George Floyd makes it, I can't cry tears for you. That's not what we're going through. So a lot of different levels of thing going on, but definitely a lot of conversation around sport and what sports has to do with the moment. And maybe Javier can speak to that.
Thank you for that transition, most definitely. I think immediately what I will say on a personal level first is my work, the dissertation that I'm writing is about human trafficking in U.S. high school basketball with Black international youth, particularly from Latin America. And it stems from a personal story of a young person from Panama who ended up in my care, trying to pursue a hoop dream in the United States, largely to escape the position that he's been placed as a Black man from a part of Panama that's considered to be very Black, to move himself in a certain position. And he got to a point in this country where he would have been in a position that he might not have had the proper legal status to stay here. And I can remember this day vividly when the lawyer, who was a pro bono immigration attorney, was working with us, and she said, Javier, I'm gonna talk to him, but you have to understand he's a Black man. And it's not when he's gonna have, it's not if he's gonna have a confrontation with the police, it's when. And that resonated with me because I'm a Black man. And I was like, I know exactly what she's telling me right now. And as bad as I want him, would like for him to have this opportunity to pursue that hoop dream, because I know what waits for him at home. I'm like, I think his life is more important. But when Javier Amber, the Black Panamanian man from Texas, who we just was revealed was murdered by the police this week, when I saw that, my immediate feeling was him in that phone call. Because it was nothing about him being Panamanian. It was nothing about him speaking Spanish. It was nothing about him that saved him from that violence that happened to him on that day. And I just reflected like, dang, that was the call that we had. In talking about what is the place of sport within that conversation. So I reflect back on all of my interactions that I have with particularly young Black men in Panama, but in the United States as well. And I usually do it through a sport lens because of my experience working with sport. And I think it's super important, just like Masauko is mentioning with his son, that I honestly feel like these players have a responsibility, professional ones. Professional players have a responsibility to do these things, because like Dr. Harry Edwards says, they didn't get there by people being silent and not their whole careers. You know, you got the Muhammad Ali's and this whole group of men and women who decided that justice for their group was better than economic gain for themselves. And in one of my high notes during this whole entire time talking about mentorship, I work with student athletes on the University of Texas campus as well. And this is the second student athlete that I work with who has done something very controversial in the name of group solidarity. One of the star receivers of the team said he refused to play another snap for this institution. He can't support them taking from them without giving anything back. He understands what he represents. And then a former athlete who I used to work with, who now plays in the NFL, he, again, I remember the day in study hall, this young man, they used to call and say, look, we have somebody we think you would enjoy working with. That means that, when you tell me that means that this person is at risk. And I know what that means. But I love those kids because it's not about the school, it's about them. And they're like, he's hard to work with. You know, I'm going in, I'm telling him, we're not even talking about school. I'm throwing school in there. You got to do it, but we're not talking about school. I remember the day he walked out of study hall, he gave me this paper. He said, read this paper. And he had written a poem, and it was called A Little Letter to America. And it was talking about every issue that we're still talking about to this day. And I was like, this is amazing. And he was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I'm like, well, you do what you feel you need to do with it. I'm not going to tell you what to do with it. And he's uploaded it on his social media profiles. And wow, the amount of backlash that this young man received for putting something like that, very similar to the way Colin Kaepernick was treated. But now, you know, the tables have turned and people are wanting to be apologetic. So I'm so glad that I can be in position to have conversations with these young people about who they are larger than what they do. Because hopefully in those conversations, I'm so hopeful that one day when they're just thinking about something, they're like, man, let me step on some toes today. Or let me think, you know, and feel okay with doing it. Feeling okay with doing it and understanding that I'm not what I do. I am a man, a Black man who has the talent and ability to play football, to play basketball, to play soccer, but that's not who I am. I'm so many things, and this is just one thing I happen to be very good at, by the way, very good at, but it's not who I am. It shouldn't define me. So that's how I really look at what I do, and I do it in the Panamanian context as well with the young I work with that play football or soccer about the same way. With these conversations about police brutality, putting it in conversation. They call me, they leave me, you know what? They leave me 6-minute, 7-minute voice notes, and I'm like, I gotta listen to all this. I gotta listen to this whole voice note, and then come up with a response. But these conversations, I just love them, and I think it helps them develop positive racial identities about themselves.
Okay.
Such powerful responses. I have 2 girls. One was born face up, eyes open. And the other one was born blue, cord around the neck. The 3-year-old, the little one, face up, eyes open. Her no is very intact. Didn't have to teach her that. Didn't have to activate that. And the big one, the 10-year-old, I sent her to a daycare preschool that was called Little Maroons. So if M was the letter of the week, then Mutulu Shakur was the freedom fighter of the week. And if A was the letter of the week, then it was probably Asada who was the freedom fighter of the week. And so she's come up inside a kind of activation and a kind of sort of revolutionary sort of understanding of herself and her lineage in the world. And so when all of this has been happening, she goes to a school where she's a part of the climate change club and part of the government club. And so Ishara lives, this is again, baby born blue. She's not blue anymore. She very much lives in a space of agency. And what I think has been really interesting, she said to me, Mom, I participated in this Roblox protest. Roblox, you know what Roblox is, right? So what did you all do? So people from all over just came into this room, and we had our signs and we were making our chat. And so what I find with young people with her, and a lot of people her age, is they live this, and they're creating meaning, new ways of social engagement and also civic engagement in these digital spaces that is so fascinating to me. What we went to, as a family, to a protest this past weekend, and she led a couple of chants with some prompting. And I think one thing that's my throat has been in my chest, because I remember I didn't come into sort of activist agency until I was like inside my early 20s, that kind of thing. And I remember Troy Davis, and we did all kinds of marching, all kinds of writing, all kinds of calling, all kinds of praying, and I'm still not over it. I'm still not over it. And so as I watch and encourage and teach and instruct and sort of help her understand about protracted processes of both agitation and civic engagement and all of that, there's a part of like, man, when is it going to break her heart? And these are not, these kinds of breaks, they don't end you. Clearly, you're still in the movement, it's still in the struggle, it's still in the process. But they mark you, for me. And I have, they're fire children, but they're tender children. I'm their mother. They're tender. And as excited as I am, as much as I celebrate and stoke their fire, for justice and their understanding that they need to participate in creating it and shaping it. As a mother, I said, like, when is this going to break their heart? When is this going to break their heart?
No, I appreciate all of your reflections, the personal accounts, and particularly what it's been like as you're rearing your own children and or mentoring young people in this historical moment. Because I too have children. I have 2 teenagers, a son and a daughter. One is college bound very soon. And when I think about the kinds of conversations that we have in our household, because, you know, mom's an academic and she's all about Black people. So that's sort of the messaging that gets interpreted by my children since they could recall as early as kindergarten. And it's like, that's what mommy does. She talks about Black people and that's it, right? And to really understand that for them too, you know, they were both in elementary school when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And, you know, we've been watching the news, and I mean, just adding on the names, the Sandra Blands and the, you know, Michael and the, I mean, Eric Gardner's. I mean, it's just progressively in their whole rearing and experiences as young people coming up to even now, for them, it's a little bit heartbreaking because they've said, when is this ever going to end? When are we going to have respect and be treated with the dignity and the humanity that we deserve? And this has been a constant sort of question for them. And then now it's even complicated about, well, what happens when they leave the home, which is considered a safe space, except for Breonna Taylor, where she was murdered in her home and in her bed, right? Where it makes it very highly charged and uneasy. But even for them as they're aging too, it's like, well, what happens when we leave the house? I mean, even in COVID, they walked outside of our door and just to kind of walk around the little cul-de-sac that's nearby. And there was a police car just driving by and they said they froze, you know, and you know, I have a 17 and a 14-year-old, so they're not little children, and they're both over 5'10", right? Unlike me, I'm the tiniest person. So for them, they physically take up more space, and they were frightened because for them, it's just like, well, I perpetually have a target on on our backs. And so what happens when I leave home to go to school, to walk in the neighborhood, to ride my bike? My son is like, well, what happens if I decide to go away to college that's too far from home? And the reality is, I can't even protect you then. And that's the sad part, in the space of trying to be encouraging, to say, there are ways that we can be engaged in and evoke our activist spirit. That if you don't feel comfortable physically being out in spaces, what are the other kinds of things that you can do to speak out and act out against the injustices that you're experiencing? Because not to sound so cliche, but they are our future. So how are we empowering them, even though for us it's still heartbreaking? Like, Desiree, you're like, I'm still hurting, right? Natasha, you talked about, hey, being born and growing up in the context that's post the murders of iconic civil rights leaders who probably at the time people didn't really value as much as they do now in terms of revisionist history of 2020, right? But it's like we still carry that, and this new generation, they're looking to us. So what are some of the encouraging words that we can give them? I mean, do we just say fight the good fight and continue on? I mean,
it's spiritual.
Go on.
It's spiritual. The first element that we must always understand is, as Audre Lorde said, we were not meant to survive, right? But yet and still here we are. And if we look at it from another perspective, we weren't meant to survive, but here we are at the vanguard of a movement with the whole world looking to us and behind us. So we also have to be aware that there's a trajectory of consistent struggle that's been going on, of course, globally. And I think that's where oftentimes we make the mistake of not tying in everybody from Ida B. Wells to Frederick Douglass to Zora Neale Hurston to, Stuart Hall. And there's people all around the world, Walter Rodney, of course, who've been struggling and have given their lives to this. And they see this battle, we see this battle, right, if we're looking at it correctly, as one that's multi-generational and going to be continuing. And that's why we continually give our kids this information. But at the same time, there's a statement that I was walking on the street in Brooklyn one day and I saw a man wearing a shirt. And on the shirt he had, I believe, he was wearing a t-shirt that had a picture of, I think, Barack Obama and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And I said to him, brother, doesn't it worry that you got a t-shirt on where two of those brothers in that, and it was during Barack Obama's presidency, two of those brothers got killed, brutally murdered. Like, doesn't it worry you to have the other the man who's our president on that shirt right now? And he said, what is for you is for you. Whether that be $1 million, whether that be a brick falling off the top of a building onto your head, whether that be a bullet, it's already written. So you can't sit up and worry about that. And that's sort of the way I need my kids to walk into the world, is to understand you can't walk into the world from day to day with this notion that of your ending. You have to walk into the world with the notion of what you are part of beginning, and understand that when it's your time, that's already written in the book, wherever it is. It's your time, it's your time. Octavia Butler got killed by like a stone outside the front of her house. So that's my concept. It's spiritual, it's ancestral. We are in a protracted struggle that's gonna last multi-generations. And we have lots of folks who are unseen walking with us into this battle daily.
They say that all great revolutionaries were revolutionaries because of the love of people, right? And I think I start at the basics, the beginning, spirituality, and then also I teach my children to be kind. I teach my children to share. The reason that it's a human right that everyone should have a place to live, that it's a human right that, to be educated, it's a human right to be able to defend your body, is because at the core, there are ways that we should treat each other as human beings. And I think if those values are internalized, then when you see people's human rights being aggressed or transgressed, then you're going to have a reaction in your heart and not just your head, because it's the reaction in your heart that's going to sustain the action to defend human rights. And now we need analysis, yeah? We need history, we need an understanding of how resources are distributed, we need an understanding of how governments sort of enact power violently. We need an understanding of, the priorities of property and people. We need all these understandings, but we need those understandings, I think, to be anchored by sort of core sensibilities around how I'm supposed to treat people and how people should treat me. And so I always sort of weave in those two layers of conversation I'm talking with. Mostly the big one now, we can reach some of those other, but when you're talking, don't yell, speak to people properly. Speak to people, that person has a spirit. Don't do that person's body. That person lives in their body. That's their own, these are and one, when we have police who are being violent against people's bodies, like, who didn't teach you to respect other people's bodies? Who didn't teach you to be kind? Who hurt you? You know what I mean? That made it so much so that what are you carrying that you so that callously hurt other people? And so I think I personally, what am I saying to them is a sort of combination of things. And that yes, you can be angry. Yes, you can be sad. How are you communicating effectively with agency? And at the same time, what are you grateful for? Because that's the fuel. And what's the vision? What do you want? This is what you're upset about. What would be the right thing? And so that those conversations, so they critically engage and make choices and analysis for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump?
Oh yes, go right ahead.
One of the things that really struck me for what Des was saying is this idea of a core sense of self and values, right? This idea, this basic understanding of humanity and the valuing of it. And not only the humanity that is tangible, but the idea of the sacrifices of the ancestors, people who've come before and done the work. And for me, I've been really thinking about, as a Black woman, as an academic, as a mother, as someone who is insider, outsider in terms of watching from the ground what's happening in the United States, particularly even with COVID and then the uprisings. I've been really thinking about this idea from the NAP ministry, which I love, which is sort of this really radical concept that Black women have put together about rest. Rest is a form of resistance. Rest is a form of reparation, right? This idea that Black people have constantly done the work, and the idea of standing still and resting and sitting in silence and not constantly giving without actually replenishing to ourselves as workers, as parents, as people who love and engage. If we actually decide to rest, to sleep, to be peaceful, to be silent, to look inward, that will give us the ability to actually say and conceptualize the things about when it's enough for the sustained run, right? So it's not just this is what's going to happen now, but Bob Marley said, those who fight and run away will come back and fight another day. I mean, for me, it's this idea of really understanding, if you just throw yourself out there and give and give and give, it's just going to be a shell. But other people need to do the work now. It is not our job to constantly pick up and educate everybody. We've done that work, and it's that when you were asking the question right at the beginning about, how is this impacting your professional career? I talked about COVID, but one of the things that's happening with the uprisings are the consistent and constant and just, I mean, flooding of requests by sort of white spaces to say, can you teach us? Can you hold these conversations around race? That is not my work. And if I am going to do it, it's going to be a one-off where I am very much compensated, right? And compensated for the emotional energy, not necessarily for the intellectual stuff, because you can read the intellectual stuff, but for the emotional energy of engaging, it has to be very specific, because my commitment is to rest. I want to see my grandchildren, and I want my children to be able to create a world that is powerful for them, that they understand they were meant to be here and do these things. But if we do not hold our resting, our spiritual space, if we don't hold up on that, then we don't really have the armor. Because yes, at the end of the day, Floyd's murder and all these other atrocious cycles of police brutality really are just a part of the entire problem, which is essentially capitalism. And that goes back to the colonial moment and prior to the colonial moment. And if we cannot look at capitalism and think about disengaging that in materialism and consumerism, then we're just going to go back to watching the NBA at Disneyland, and it's over. And that's my problem. My worry is that folks in the United States who are at the vanguard of this movement, they have to look out of their navels and understand that this is not just, police brutality that's happening now is an everyday occurrence. It is not this is interrupting my line at getting my Starbucks. But this is an everyday occurrence for so many people, Black and brown and indigenous people all over the world, every single day, who lived in militarized states. And those states are established because of their relationship with capitalism and the United States and the global north. And so for me, I'm just like, look up. The whole world is ready. What are you going to do? And I think that what needs to happen is that we need to understand, we need to rest, we need to have our spirituality, and we need to create community and conversations. Because if we're asking the system to reform, we're going to be at the NBA watching it in Disneyland.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate your pivot too, because that helps, again, this conversation it's supposed to capture the global perspectives. And so I know that for each of the countries that we represent here, right? So Antigua, Costa Rica, Grenada, Trinidad, Malawi, Panama, each of these countries have their own unique histories, right? Social, political histories, economic histories, and its relationships with capitalism, institutionalized systems of oppression. And even for some countries, we have governments that are powerfully oppressive, are inhumane and corrupt. So if we can kind of juxtapose what we're seeing and even experiencing, because we've all been in the US, but we've also been abroad as well as in our ancestral lands. These countries are, in fact, perhaps acting differently and reacting differently to the democratic upheaval and the resistance efforts, right? So if we were to compare what we're seeing in the US, but what you all are experiencing in your ancestral lands, if you can kind of speak to, well, what are some of the impacts that you're seeing around the non-US sort of media representations around protests versus rioting and looting? Like, how are people talking about the conversations as it relates to racial injustice? And even prior to these uprisings, and then what's the conversation now? What are you hearing people saying out on the streets as it relates to racial injustice and what, the inhumane treatment of African descendants?
I would say I just want to acknowledge something. There's a classic Antiguan calypso tune, and one of the lines goes, "In Antigua and Barbuda, where they bury my navel string." When I was born in Antigua, I'm not quite sure what they did with my navel string, but whatever it is, it's there. But I live here, and I always want to acknowledge, and because I grew up was brought here as a child, grew up very much in my memory. And there's a way in which I wasn't really here. I was in my mother's house. And I say here, I mean North America, New York. But more and more I come to understand myself, yes, as an Antiguan, but very much as an Antiguan in the diaspora, and in some ways very Pan-Caribbean. So I want to just contextualize my perspective and my representation by that, yeah? I would say, really interestingly, I've noticed this in the last maybe decade or so. Antiguans have peaked the game. There was a time when everybody wanted to come to America. Everybody wanted to come to London. Everybody wanted to go. This is they come and they visit you here and they see you live in your little box and the place dirty, and how the police, they keep on every couple of weeks they see police shooting you and you and you and you and you. They're not confused, yeah? And as much as anywhere, as a people who, like, we come out of Garvey's womb, if I can say that, right? We are the children of meaningful, long-lasting Pan-Africanist sentiments globally. So whenever we see Black people shot in the street, choke held in the street, we feel it, we wring our hands, but we're not surprised and we're not confused. And I think particularly this thing, what you're all doing over there still, Muta Baruka told us it no good for stay in a white man country too long. It no good for stay in a white man country too long. If you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're Black, get back, or you better attack. It no good for stay in a white man country too long, right? So I definitely feel like generally people are thriving at home and they don't know why we stay. And so especially Antigua, I know in St. Lucia in Jamaica, there have been like actual protests. In Antigua, not quite as much. And I think in part because we're a very small place, COVID has been very destabilizing. I think the political, the civic engagement is really around labor. And I think that the parallel is that in the way that Black bodies are in peril and the state is weaponized against Black bodies here using the police and that kind of thing, there's a way in which the economy is weaponized against Black bodies in the Caribbean, in places like Antigua. And I think that is the sort of Pan-Africanist parallel, the capitalist analysis, class analysis, that is how the most thoughtful among us are thinking about, these convergences.
I can talk about, I think, the Panamanian context, but again, I put it in context as well that I'm here in the United States. I'm in Austin, Texas, so I'm no longer physically in Panama, but Panama is somewhere for me very similar to what Desiree is saying, and very similar to what other Caribbean people, the navel string. My navel string is in Austin, Texas, and I'll never ever hide that, because that's a part of who I am. Decided to live in Panama, and in Panama large is a place where I feel like I found myself, and it's where my father's from, it's where my grandmother is from, my grandfather is from, and it's somewhere that I had to go experience for myself as a young person. I entered into this with my nose wide open, having a large set of beliefs about what I would expect. But Panama was a place where I figured it came to me that what was most salient about me in Panama was me being Black, and a big Black man on top of that. Because there was the only thing that could save me in Panama when situations became very tense, particularly with law enforcement officials, was that my Spanish was accented with a U.S. accent, that I could pull out my Texas driver's license instead of my Panamanian ID to lessen the blow of that to lessen that blow that they wanted to give me to move. But the reality of it is I'm able to pull on that privilege from the US in ways that people who look just like me, who share the same blood as me, cannot do in their own country, because they are tied to that country. And because their citizenship is of that country has the authority to do whatever they want with that body. So that's my experience with Panama. And that's why I really think about my experience in Panama and now out in very ways, because the country is it's a very racialized situation. And I think, as largely speaking, how police with police brutality, again, this is a continuation of a conversation. I think what's happening, from what I've seen from the people that I've been in communication with, because not everybody in Panama, regardless of their racial, ethnic background, thinks the way that I think, the things, interpret the things the way that I interpret them. But what I've been able to see, that people have been able to identify, particularly those who receive the most, who are victimized the most, Black people who don't have to ask the question if they're Black or never thought about being anything else. They're like, I see that. That's happened to me. That's very similar to me. And they've been able to move their voices into a way to attempt to be heard. Then there's always this large contingency in the country that will say things here aren't as bad as in the United States, or yeah, but here it's not about race only. It's just it's class. It's not race. It's hard for me to accept those things, because they keep pushing those voices that are now feeling confident enough to step out and say it to the back. But then I asked the question, I was like, well, how can we not talk about police brutality in the institutionalized state and its racialized face that it has, if we don't talk about the 5 Black boys that were burned to death in the Panamanian Juvenile Detention Center in 2011? How can we not say this is not a racialized violence, assault on Black people, if the young man Javier Rodriguez from Kurundu in 2017, who had Down syndrome, who the police threw tear gas into his home, and he wasn't even participating in the protest, and he died? How can we not include that into a conversation? Because it's easy to say it's the United States. It's easy to say it, but it's even harder to say that it's us. And largely, but I see those we haven't had the protests as large as we have with George Floyd, as Panama had for COVID-19 at the beginning of the outbreak. But this idea of I can't breathe is the same thing of being able to eat, health or hunger. You're telling me I need to be at home. But institutionally, I have not been able to stay at home because I have to be in public space because I live day to day. So you're telling me I have to go inside. And we see these uprisings happen in these very Black spaces in the country. Kurundu, Colon, San Joaquin, El Chorrillo, very Black spaces, ideologically speaking and physically speaking. But the question of race would never enter into the conversation. It's the culture. It's the class system. Kurundu, and I'll tell you this and I'll close, is a second largest predominantly Black area in Panama City. They have the 3rd highest infection rate of COVID-19. And this was revealed this week as the country went back into quarantine because of the spike in cases. 500, even more than Costa Rica, short period of time. So they went back, and Kurundu enters to this space. And the news, this is so interesting, the news does an entire report about why Kurundu, a predominantly Black area, is suffering at higher rates than other parts of the country. And their rationale is it's the culture of those people. It's they wearing masks. They like being in close contact with each other. And no conversation was had about how this area even became. Why do you have 10 people living inside one house? Why do they not have access to healthcare? Why have they been protesting? Because they haven't been able to eat, because they haven't been able to work, and we won't have that conversation. So I think those protests that I saw at that time are very similar to what we're seeing now in the US, particularly in other parts around the world that are talking about no justice, no peace in the name of George Floyd, in the name of Breonna Taylor. But Black people in Panama have been screaming the same thing: I can't breathe, but I'm hungry. And for me, it's the same thing. But we refuse in certain and probably the most important parts of the society, the most important parts, to acknowledge that when a part of the country that's predominantly Black is saying, I can't eat, is the same thing as African Americans in the US saying, I can't breathe. And they refuse to acknowledge it. Refuse to acknowledge it.
Thank you. Natasha or Masauko, what's the state in Costa Rica?
Can I go? Because I'd like to, a lot of what I have to say kind of extends what Javier was saying, because I'd like to speak to, I'm in constant communication. My family's from Malawi. I have relatives that are living there now, and we're in constant communication. I've also spent a lot of time as a musician in South Africa, and I also consider it one of the places that I call home, because there's so many people that I love there. And I met Natasha in South Africa, actually, and we began our relationship in South Africa.
Black love.
So I particularly bring up these two places because they give you a bit of different African context, okay? In Malawi, COVID-19 numbers are still, I believe, under 500, okay? And at this point, we've already gone through the moment where the government tried to have a lockdown, and immediately the people said, no, you're not locking down this place because there's so many of us who depend on being able to go out into the market and sell vegetables. I mean, most people, Malawi is farmers. Most everybody is living an agrarian life. So I have to go sell these vegetables in the marketplace or I cannot feed my children. So a very clear statement came back from the people to the government that said, we would rather die of this disease working to feed our children than die in our houses looking at our children starve. How the police brutality part plays into it. In Malawi, they're just now glimpsing aspects of the racial reality, because historically our country began being run by a Black government in 1964. However, we were run by a Black government in a white supremacist consciousness. This was done by a dictator named Kamuzu Banda. The university in Malawi from the 60s on almost all the way to the 90s, it was basically illegal to be a teacher there and be Black. Like all of the teachers in the university were white, and he was framing the consciousness in Malawi towards a very westernized consciousness. So the young people in Malawi, many of them, not the intellectual class, but the young people and the students who are just getting glimpses in the world are going, wow, that's not what we thought white people were. Like literally, it's that innocent in many situations. Now, juxtapose that against South Africa, where they have a history of apartheid, and they're kind of like sitting back going, yeah, well, that's what the United States is. That's what it's always been. It's the same sort of consciousness that built South Africa. We're not surprised at all. And in all reality, my friends from South Africa can list it back to 1619 onward, and they feel their voices inside of it. They're just they're just inside of it as though we're one people. In a way, in many ways, we were like that in the 80s with South Africa. In the States, they were just part of what we were doing, but we sort of lost that. I feel it hasn't been as intense, but the South Africans are very much with us in the States right now, and they're super conscious about it. And they're also very interesting for us to watch, because they have, in just the few years of their existence as a now capitalist nation, having moved from being an apartheid state, they have joined capitalism in a way that's way beyond the way we have, because now you have people who are, you know, the ANC has some ownership over the mines in South Africa. They're making money off of what De Beers used to make money on all on their own. Now the ANC is cut in, right? So I don't know if you'd heard about what happened in Marikana, but what happened was a bunch of mine workers had been killed blatantly by the police in a way that was just a massacre that reminded you of some of those massacres you saw in the States on universities in the early 70s and so forth. That happened to these miners in South Africa while the Black government, the ANC, was in power. And so they've moved into a state that's a different space, because now they've been able to see clearly that, yeah, you can reform the police, you can join capitalism, all you want, but eventually you'll find the Black cop who's working for the white supremacist system or the white global economic system will kill you exactly the same way that the white cop will kill you, because it's the same system. And so South Africa's in solidarity with us, but they're also sort of looking over going, okay, so what are we gonna do? Because if you look over at us, we're in the next phase of it. You're about to do a whole nother cycle of reform. Guess what? You may get Black cops in your neighborhood. You may get a fully Black environment where you are, but you're not going to stop what the class warfare is going to do within a capitalist structure. So South Africa's totally aware they're with us, but they're also looking at us going, you may want to look at what happened here a little more closely.
Thank you for that. Natasha?
Des, did you want to just say something before I okay. Just very quickly, I think your question said, you know, sort of what was the conversation prior to the uprisings in regards to racism, and then sort of what's happening now on the ground in Costa Rica. So I just need to say that Costa Rica very much is sort of a white presenting, fairly middle class sort of mestizo country. Right? It does not mean that there are not people of Afro descent here, but similar to Panama, but I think with less sort of visual public representation, there are pockets of the country that have been sort of established as where the Black people are, right? So on the Caribbean coast is Puerto Limon, and that's sort of where, you know, the Blackness manifests or performs itself, right? But in actuality today, the numbers of Afro-Costa Ricans who are actually originating as Afro-Caribbeans who came to work on the railroad and the banana plantations under the United Fruit Company, those people are actually a second wave of people who were not enslaved, who came as, you know, intentional laborers to then get their money and go back home and build Jamaica, build Barbados, build sort of the Anglophone Caribbean. But obviously it didn't work out that way, and multiple generations were established. And that is my lineage, right? So I come from that Jamaican space of people who came to work and create a living, but then go back home. At least that was the first generation. 4 generations in, by the time my mother's born, obviously they have a different relation to the nation, right? But in 1948, the country basically absorbed those Afro-Caribbean people into Afro-Costa Ricans. And in the process, they asked them to do certain things, right? So if you are going to, even if you were born in Costa Rica, only until 1948, you had to get nationalized, you had to legalize your process of belonging to this nation. But that meant that you had to give up your English language school. You had to, you know, not perform sort of your Anglophone Caribbean identity, right? And your Black identity. You had to sort of assimilate. But what people don't talk about, and it's not in the history of Costa Rica, is that Costa Rica had slavery for over 200 years, right? And so the colonial establishment of Costa Rica, there were enslaved and free Afro-descended people who were here living and building this country, right? In very specific and very intimate spaces, because a lot of it was domestic spaces, right? And then on the cacao plantations. But I say this to say that the common discourse around race in Costa Rica is that racism does not exist here. right? And so, and that is literally the conversation. Oh, that place over there, race doesn't exist. We're all kind of one people, right? And so, you know, when you ask, well, what happened to those, you know, African people, Afro-descended people who were part of the colonial moment, you know, when you ask about them, they're kind of like, oh, they got absorbed into the bloodstream, and so we're all Tico, we're all one person. And so for me, my work in coming here 6 years ago was specifically to think about those questions around Blackness. How is it possible that the country that is 90% Catholic has a Black Madonna as its patron saint called La Negrita, right? And they venerate, I mean, it's a national holiday. They venerate this Black statue. She's in every home. People understand her. They bring their petitions to her, particularly because she's seen to be one that deals with health and healing. But there's a conversation that race doesn't exist or racism doesn't exist in Costa Rica. We're one. At the same time, you have sort of these pockets of Afro-descended people who constantly speak up. But I think the one who's most public is obviously our current vice president, Epsie Campbell, right? So she in many ways, she's a veteran of the political game, and she is now the vice president, and she's doing incredible work, right? And as soon as, you know, these uprisings began in the United States, she issued a statement in English and in Spanish, right? Very conscious of the audience, the global audience, in solidarity with people who are uprising. And it has become a conversation. All of a sudden, out of the woodwork, people in Costa Rica, family members, are saying, what's going on? How do I learn about this? How do I educate myself? So it's not that people are not willing, but the point is that people are sort of waking up to it, right? And so there is this conversation of Costa Rica where it's like, oh, it's an issue of class, just like Javier said, but in actuality, no, it's an issue of racism, right? And so when people begin to narratize their experiences with microaggressions of racism, of police brutality, of being pulled over, of not getting that job, of being forced to straighten their hair, of having all kinds of experiences of isolation and marginalization and not having access to resources, people begin to go, oh, really? You know, when did that happen? But it's like, but I've been always saying this thing. But the point is that you felt like those conversations were not important. But when we look at Epsie Campbell and her election, what ends up happening is that people do not critique her political savvy. The fact that she's multilingual, the fact that she is this global educated woman who has been committed to indigenous Black and brown people, women and children in Costa Rica for years. They critiqued her in the way that Michelle Obama was critiqued about her clothes and called her a monkey. And she, you know, all these things around her Black body, you know, and that is really the extent of how racism happens. And people don't read themselves, you know, and it's constantly the silencing of, okay, well, you know, you're critiquing her or these, you know, these Black people or whatever. And then as soon as you call them on it, they're like, but racism doesn't exist in Costa Rica. So what's happening now is that it's a different kind of conversation, because every single newspaper, every single TV show is calling on all the Black, every single Black person is getting that call. Can you come and sit on a Zoom call? Can you come and do an interview? I mean, it's unbelievable. But the thing is that the work has never stopped. The work has always been there. But now it's about visibility, and people are saying the same thing. They're saying the same narratives, like, we've been doing the work. Now you have to do the work.
Well, I appreciate your analysis and really calling out the class component and how it's really about race, because when you think about a lot of our nations, whether we're talking about Malawi, we're talking about Antigua, Panama, or even Grenada and Trinidad, right? And it's a relatively homogenous racialized population or citizenry, right? Yeah, there are other groups that have immigrated and contributed to the diverse fabric of these countries. However, when they are also in position of the global capitalism that exists, right, where there's a denigration and a subjugation and a servitude of homogeneously African descended nations, it might be expressed in everyday class-based ways, but it is very racialized in the ways in which our cultural imperialism and our colonial experiences with nations like the United States have been engaged with us. And I reflect and have to give a little plug or shout out to folks that I actually have in Grenada who, in preparation for our call, I said, what's going on the streets in Grenada around COVID as it relates to what's happening, and then these recent uprisings. And so in context, it's like, for many people who are watching and listening, I mean, Grenada is a very small island nation that's in the Lesser Antilles of the Caribbean. It's like 30 minutes away from Venezuela and from Trinidad. It was once colonized by both the French and the British. And about 85 to 90% of the population are direct African descendants that were enslaved and brought to this country. We've had other people come through, Southeast Asians, Syrians, more recently, the Chinese, that they've been very effective in infiltrating not only the continent of Africa, but also the Caribbean, right? And Grenada in and of itself, so Grenada as a nation oftentimes also counts Petite Martinique and Carriacou. But all together, according to what's already been reported as an estimate, there's only less than 113,000 people. That's it. And about 40% of the population are actually people that leave to go to places like the United States, Canada, the UK, and perhaps to other neighboring countries like Barbados and Aruba and Cuba. And who's left is on the median age is 32 years old. So not only is this a small place, but this is a very young population. And so when I'm asking, folks like my dad or even family friends, what is the temperature of what's happening down in Grenada, they are talking in the same way that Desiree was talking about, right? That, like, why are all these people like in America and all these places? You need to be able to come back. We have our own issues, right? Because just like Masauko talked about Malawi being very agricultural, Grenada is known for its agricultural base. Although the current government system is not maximizing on the actual value and resource that the land is there for the people to develop, but instead they're outsourcing the land for external entities like the Chinese to come and take over. It's like there's poverty. There are people who are hungry in COVID, and so their response is, well, you put us on curfew, but we need to eat, we need to flourish. And then you kind of take a step back and then think about these recent uprisings. And we have a family friend, Rosie Benjamin Henry, who is from Grenada, lived many years in England, and just very typical of the Caribbean immigration, people are coming back home, right? They're retiring. And her observation is that, seeing the news of all these uprisings and the death of Floyd and others, they needed to take a stand. But when she's out there protesting and organizing, she is, over the age of 50. She's a mother and a grandmother. And who's she mobilizing? Other mothers and grandmothers. And so out of 113,000 people, you have like 6 to 8 women out there, women in front of the US Embassy. And it's like, what is that? Right? And, they were somewhat co-opted in their efforts, I think maybe in a positive way, to be able to spread the news that there's an outcry. And so it spread across social media. She said that, there was a media outlet that showed up in front of the US Embassy, about 100 people showed. But what she began to describe was that, yes, there's a nice showing, there's an outcry, there are people who are genuinely upset, but there's definitely a disconnection between the ways in which racial injustice is talked about outside of their own everyday experience. And so then, for her, she's old enough to reflect on, no, I was alive when we had the revolution here in Grenada prior to the invasion of the United States, who was in complete rejection of the prime minister of the time, Maurice Bishop's approach to having socialism as part of its economic and political and social base. I mean, under his prime ministry, so to speak, literacy rates increased, health disparities decreased, education. I mean, it was just, there was a nice proliferation of the population, and the US invaded, and all of that sort of dissipated along with the people's fervor to fight. And so here we are in 2020, and the feedback around resistance, around these uprisings, around these issues of injustice that impacts all of them is, one, it's only impacted or seen as important by people who are expats, who've lived abroad and come back, because that's not our problem. I mean, I think there was a colloquial thing that she had said to me that it's like, why drink bush tea for someone else's illness, right? Because it's not our problem, right? And there's a complete disconnect in seeing that what's happening on this very small island nation is very much connected to what we're seeing in the United States, as well as where we're seeing in other places in the world. And perhaps it's because there's such a youthful population that none of them were alive, right? None of them were alive when the People's Revolutionary Government was established. Their parents may not even be in the country. They may be still abroad. So there's no one to teach this new population as to, well, this is why you really should be concerned, you know, and that this impacts you in a very, very important way. You know, people want to focus on the ways in which, well, why don't we keep our focus on the domestic issues like the Chinese coming in? And it's just like, you don't think the Chinese have anti-Black racism, right? You don't think that those Syrian shopkeepers who are verbally abusive and aggressive towards the population, like, you don't think that's a problem? Like, it's all interconnected. I mean, white supremacy is king in the world, right? Unfortunately, and that we need to do something about that. So, you know, I share all that because I think it's a nice way to kind of bridge all of the different issues that each of you have talked about in your ancestral homes, in terms of some people wanting to be engaged, some people really not understanding like how I see myself in these uprisings globally. But I think in many ways, it gives us an opportunity to really have a call for solidarity and action, right? So not only for our people who we can say phenotypically are African descendants, but this is even speaking to our light and whiter skinned people of color, right? The Asians, the Latinx, the indigenous people, the Southeast Asians, the Middle Easterns, the Polynesians, to really confront the anti-Black racism, right? And even for some, I mean, you talk about it too, Natasha, with the Ticos and the narrative around that. Like, how is it that one can reconcile skin color privilege and systems of white supremacy and truly acknowledge that, hey, and on a human level, we are all interconnected. We are all one, and African descendants are very much a part of our communities. So how do we engage people to really kind of like, hello, let's wake up? What should their messages and responses for support look like? And, you know, can we really get there? Oh, that was heavy. I'm sorry.
That's a tough one. You know, for me, obviously, it's about reading history, right? It's about reading and learning and educating, right? I mean, for me, that is the mode in which you can become empowered, right? And I think that there are more than enough resources available for people to do that kind of work. And if you don't know, listen, right? So there are lots of people jumping on, want to say something, but in many ways, they're engaging with something that is beyond the capacity of their knowledge. So gain knowledge, right? There's no excuse. We all literally have devices or have access to devices in many spaces, even when there's no food, right? We have access to screens that give us some information. And so it's about being in conversation, for me, at least in terms of solidarity and being becoming an ally. It is about listening, right? And it's about learning. That's what I can offer.
I would say, thinking about the Panamanian context largely, that non-Black Panamanians or Panamanians who do not identify of being of African descent, or those who are recently acknowledging having African ancestry, need to do the work as well, and need, Natasha saying, to listen to people, in that the person who's talking does not have to have any type of formal education, does not have to have any type of social clout to be able to speak on behalf of what's happening in their everyday lives. Even though in Panama, particularly, when Black women, who are mostly mothers, close down national avenues in protest, demanding to work, they might not have engaged in racialized language and saying, we Black women, Black mothers are asking, are demanding to work to feed our children. But that is a racialized conversation. That's a racialized protest that they're waging. They're making it known that our gender, our class, our race is what keeps us in this position. But people are so quick to say it's their culture, so quick to minimize the conversation and say, if they just stop having children, without acknowledging that reproductive education does not exist in the country. If you know, so it's so many things that they have to listen and be attuned to what people are saying. It's a continuation. It's not, we're just coming into a certain level of consciousness today, or if they don't scream Black, that it's not a racialized or indigenous issue. So I think they have to listen, and because they're in the positions to change, to implement policies, to change existing policies, to include Black history into our curriculum, which is a thing that happens, and that the constant fight is currently. School year, even in our educational system, we have students that are denied entry on a daily basis because of exotic hairstyles, wearing their hairs in braids and things like that. Those people have to make and to listen and act on what they're hearing and take themselves out of it. Take their grandfather or their grandmother who migrated from the interior mestizo part of the country, who lifted themselves up from the bootstraps, and comparing it to Black people, particularly in indigenous people, who whether migrated to this country intentionally or were brought to unwillingly, have been placed in certain situations that are nowhere near what your mestizo grandparent had to do when they came to the city. This is not about, it's not about you. So I think remove yourself, listen, and use your position and privilege to act, to open up the avenues, to give access to these people.
Thank you. Desiree?
Sure. I was listening to a conversation with Arundhati Roy and Imani Perry the other day, and a similar question was asked, and I really loved Arundhati's answer. She's like, there's not like one thing that people should be doing. She said that the way that we've gotten into the sort of global context of inequity, this global context of violence, this global context of grief, has been the sort of interweaving of multiple modes and systems of oppression, and so that they're so like bit by bit you have to like unweave this rug, and I think that means that we're all acting or need to act in our various spheres. I think about myself as an immigrant, as a child immigrant. I was brought here as a child, and my grandmother used to write to me, and I didn't recognize how remarkable that was until I was an adult. I was a child, and she would page and a half letters consistently. And so I was able to maintain that contact. Of course, I was also going back and forth home during summers, and again, being a Cancerian, I lived again in my imagination. So I had multiple ways of maintaining connections, but I think that I think those connections are what I survived on, and what have sort of made me and formed my sort of global awareness and perspective, and my political awareness and perspective, my movement, the tangible connectivity, right? Like I would never sit in New York and tell people in Antigua what they should do, or tell people in Barbuda or Malawi or Costa Rica or Panama or Grenada what they should be doing. But I think critically, we need to tighten up our modes and points of connectivity and collaboration, one-to-one, island to island, nation to nation, like regionally, so that we can be, I think we've been doing a lot of organizing in our silos and thinking in our silos, but I'm not sure that we've perfected yet the machine of working together. And really, and drawing the parallels that you are so beautifully drawing, Yndia, with this conversation. And I think that somehow a critical part of the work is going to be shoring up these modes of communication and connectivity one to another.
Thank you.
Okay, Yndia, I do have something to add now that I've heard other folks.
Sure
Well, Des
thing.
talked about the connectivity and the way these things are weaved together. I would suggest for people who are just trying to get an understanding of the larger aspect of what's going on, to start with How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Start with that book and begin to understand the systems and how capitalism weaved itself together, and how it involved so many different places in the world, and how one component fed the other and fed another and fed another. And then I need people who are not Black to understand that the capitalist system has always managed to find somebody to play middleman. So in Africa, when the system is in full swing, you'll find that they've imported an Indian to play the person who controls the money and be the storekeeper. They've imported people from Lebanon to do that. They've imported people, all of these people who sit in the more, in the middle spaces between Black and white are often utilized that way. One of the things, and to further that concept, right, we always speak in terms of the Chinese entering Africa and entering this space and entering that space. What we don't know oftentimes is that Bill Gates has a lot of money behind the Chinese. All those infrastructures right now for roads in Africa, for railroads in Africa, across the continent to make things move more smoothly, so we can envision new economies that are, quote, being built by the Chinese. Bill Gates has money behind that too. So when we speak in terms of the nation state right now, in terms of nation states, in terms of the Chinese are doing this, or the Americans are doing this, or so-and-so is doing this, business itself, capitalism has gone beyond the nation state at this point and is interweaving on levels where those billionaires, who we're also looking at, right? We're also looking at those billionaires to provide us with vaccines, right? It's very important to understand, for white people to understand, you're telling us that we need to trust Bill Gates, who's an innovative millionaire to you, with vaccines. But if I ask you what Bill Gates' participation was in coltan in the Congo, and ask you about the 6 million lives in the Congo that have been sacrificed in an ugly scramble for coltan, which is the mineral that's allowing us to use these computers and cell phones right now, you're gonna look at me with a blank stare and go, I know nothing about that. So we need a more complex understanding from our allies of this billionaire consciousness. The idea that Bill Gates and Soros and Trump and all of these people have something to do with the way we want to see the world manifest. And they can start with how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and then begin trying to take apart just that basic consciousness. What is it that's happened to us that makes us feel that people who become billionaires in a very unfair and brutal world are the type of people who are going to care for us and lead us to the kind of freedom that we want? Just start with that.
Thank you. So I know that right now, even for our viewers, we're almost at time. So I wanted to just provide the space for all of you, any of you, some of you, if you could provide a couple of audience takeaways that may help to inspire, inform, and support folks on their journeys of belonging to Blackness during this time, whether it be additional, like, here's some reading sources, here are different ways that you can, improve and enhance connectivity to other groups. I mean, yeah, I just want to kind of leave that space there for you all to share with our audience.
May I jump in?
Sure.
So for me, I think this is a time still that we need to focus on self-care, right? And so I think it's really important to take stock in our health, because when you look around the world, people that look like us are essential workers in every capacity, right? And we are the caretakers. We are the ones who provide, we provide the labor. And this is not a new narrative, but the point is that it's not just about surviving now, it is about thriving while other people do the work that they need to do, as I said before. And so for me, it is about self-care. And I guess the only thing I'd love to read this quote that the NAP ministry, and I mentioned that before, that I've been really working through in the last couple of days, and it's been part of my conversation. But if I can just offer this as a way for people to think about their self-care that they have to commit to. So rest is a form of resistance because it disrupts and pushes back against capitalism and white supremacy. And I think that's incredible, right? Standing still, resting, staying alive and thriving in this time. And it's okay to be inside of Black joy and love in this moment. That is the absolute form of uprising, rebellion, and revolution. It does not always have to be the breaking of Black bodies. We are in solidarity, but it is bigger than that, right? It is about structural racism, institutional capitalism. It is about how to figure out creating communities that don't ask and are not looking for these institutions of power to recreate or reform for us, but it is about creating these communities and revisioning a world for ourselves. And we can only do that when we are rested.
Amazing. I think some tips that I would leave with the listening, or the viewing audience and listening audience is to definitely read. Get their hands on as much reading material as they can to educate themselves about the diaspora and about whatever it is they want to know about. I think that's super important. And then leaning more on my background with sport. I played U.S. American football, the tackle version. And the idea that we always were told was do your 111. With 11 players on the side of the ball, there's 11 players on the other side of the ball, you have to do your part. You might not get the glory, you might not get the fame, you might not touch the ball, you might not do this, but you have to do your part. So that means if your part is to read today, that's what your part is. If your part is to go to school and get your education, to be able to provide for your family and remove yourself from a certain circumstance or break a generational cycle that has been repeated, that's your 111. That's what you are supposed to be doing as part of the team. So I always encourage people to help find whatever your purpose is and be okay with living within that, because that's going to be very, 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 very important to where we're going. And if it's your charge and if it's your call to be vocal about issues of injustice, and you want to be on that front line and you want to do it the way that you feel is most beneficial within benefiting more people, you do that, because that's your part. And then for people who work in academic spaces, who are on campuses with student athletes, my advice to you is to treat them as people and not to treat them as a sport that they play, and to allow those stereotypes that we often carry about these young people to be eradicated from your thinking, and allow yourself to think about these young men, these young women, or however they identify themselves, as people who are able to perform at a high level, but at the core of it, they're a person. It needs to be developed intellectually, spiritually, personally, as any other person occupying your space, and you should treat them as such. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
I want to go before Des, because Des has that way of summing things up. She's that kind of Black woman. So listen to Bob Marley. Like, make a spiritual practice of having Bob Marley in your day as a regular friend and visitor right now. Particularly amongst the Black folks, the Survival album is a really important piece of work, because it speaks to African unity. The song Africa Unite is there at the center of the whole piece. And it, you know, I was listening to it yesterday as I walked through the neighborhood, and it just made the flowers a little brighter. It made everything that was happening around me a little more tranquil in the way that Natasha described. And that feeling allowed me to move towards more of a feeling of hope, and more than hope, like, it motivated me to want to get some reading done, some writing done, to participate. And that's the main thing. I think Natasha nailed it in the idea of don't let yourself get exhausted, right? The other idea around rest, right, is that we can rest on our spending, right? Because one of the ways you can hit capitalists the hardest is to boycott spending and investing and putting your money into so many things. Let's give a rest to what we choose to spend on right now. As far as books go, Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery is another one that, you know, everyone who wants to know what's really going on should be checking that out. C.L.R. James' book on the Haitian Revolution, Ida B. Wells' work around lynching. Look up those people, check out what they're doing. And again, listen to Bob Marley. That's what I'd say right
now. Masauko is my brother. I was going to tell people about music to listen to. Natasha is my divine feminine sister, and I think that the rest piece is absolutely political and alchemical. It's critical. Javier, I'm so glad to meet you, new comrade. And Yndia, you our general today. I salute you too, sis. Salute you too. And I am going to come out of my head, and I'm going to give you all this little bit of singing, right? And it was just something that I feel like comes to this thing. And it says, sometimes we stumble while we toil, and though there's gnashing of teeth for the bread and oil, water, wind, fire, soil, whisper victory is yours, my child. See, we coming in near and far. See we coming in from the dark. See we crisp, we clean, we shiny hearted, finishing what you started. Summoning soldiers and warriors and angels, summoning them to my side. Fashioning weapons out of prayers, sent directly to the ears of our people who have died. Summoning soldiers, summoning soldiers. And it's essentially just a tune that talks about remembering, recalling the work and the warring and the healing of our ancestors, summoning that about us and women.
Mm-hmm. Ashe, ashe.
Ashe.
And so
Beautiful.
it is.
Beautiful, beautiful. And it's so lovely you ended on that note, because I started off the recording with Harry Belafonte, and what did he start off? His first sentence: we use our craft, our artistry to uplift people. And that's what each of you in your craft, writing, your scholarship, your art, all of that. And that's what we're doing. And that's really the intention of just my work in this space. And so on that note, I thank you. I thank you, Masauko Chipembere, Desiree Gordon, Dr. Natasha Gordon-Chipembere, and Javier Wallace for what I consider an insightful conversation on #Uprisings 2020 and its role in our journey of belonging to Blackness. Thank you to our audience for tuning in and supporting this project. Peace.
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 There you have it. The journey isn't over, but this episode is. Until next time, peace.